All right, first, I know I had thrown out on one of the emails, although I was told by someone even last night that they dutifully did not read it. So I had promised that I was going to have a giveaway book.
Ooh. Oh, I thought you said you were giving us all of them.
Well, actually, that is the thing.
You get one!
I like when he's over. I've got another book for my show.
We're learning the readers in the room.
The excited ones. I know the others going, But we thought, especially since some of you were having fun posting things, memes related to the book in the first place, that this would be a great topic, and thanks to Jonathan Reese, who was able to make the connection, because Ted and his wife were actually students of Jonathan's back at Concordia, Texas. Both having gone through the DCE program at the time, and then Ted continued on to seminary, is now currently a church planter north of Austin, correct?
Yeah, George, I'm sorry, I had my audio off.
Okay, perfect. So the structure for this, Brandon is hiding from being in front of the camera because he didn't want to be there yet. We'll force him there later. But I think the way we kind of talked about doing this was give Ted kind of a half hour to kind of talk through the major concepts in the book, and then we've handed out index cards so you guys can jot down questions as you go. And some of you who do things like need to have second things to do at the same time, will probably be skimming the book and writing questions and listening all at the same time. So that gives our ADD crowd something to occupy themselves. But otherwise, let me pray for you, Ted, and then we will turn things over to you. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you, Lord, for gathering us today. Thank you for Ted and for his wife and for their work on this book. And just bless him as he talks to us today about his understanding of how we can, as a church, minister as well as possible to a generation that is often misunderstood. And just one that we love in Christ, and it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Ted, I will turn things over to you.
Great. Well, as mentioned, my name is Ted Doering, and I grew up. You guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I grew up just north of Houston. My wife grew up northwest of Austin. We met at Concordia, had a couple classes. I think her junior and senior year, and Professor Reese to me came in at that point. I think my senior year, and so glad we get to connect about this. And I'm really excited to see not just one book but many books. The joke we've been telling people: "Oh, why'd you write this book?" Because we need new floors downstairs. So the more books, the better. But really, this came about. It's a funny story because. I had a good friend at seminary who they started, I think the year after I left, or I wasn't one of the chosen the year I was there my fourth year. They started taking groups of students down to best practices in Phoenix. And one of my buddies texted me and said, hey, walking into another sectional on how to reach millennials taught by a boomer. And in my youth, I hopped on Facebook and jumped directly onto my soapbox for about 3 paragraphs worth of saying, hey, this isn't a bad thing, but we have a voice now. We can talk. You can ask us. We know these people. And Dale Meyer, who's the president of seminary, happened to see that. And, so here's his first year in the parish seminarian who has now just jumped on and soapboxed for a good couple paragraphs, and instead of being angry, he said, that's interesting, and forwarded it on to his daughter, who is one of I think she's the VP of marketing at CPH, and they contacted us about a year ago and said, hey, do you want to write a book on millennials? And we said, okay, and that's really what got the ball rolling. But what was behind that is a heart of saying, we know right now that the statistics keep leaning more and more towards millennials leaving the church. And not only do those statistics exist, but we see it. And, when you look at right now, they're measuring the millennial generation to be in the 90 million range in our country. And I think it's 35% now have said they're nuns. So you have multiple millions of people who have said, not only do I not have religion, I don't need it. And so for Chelsea and I, really our heart in writing the book was to say, what we get frustrated by so many times is seeing our generation pigeonholed into the stereotypes that either the news is talking about or marketing agencies have built to connect with us. And what we saw was so much millennials are entitled, or they're lazy, or they're snowballs. And we looked around at the people that are our friends and we said, well, yeah, we all kind of have some of those tendencies, but most of us are hardworking and we're starting things. And when we came out of college, there was nothing there for us to do. And so we started creating things. And what we wanted to do was to say, we love and have incredible mentors in Gen X and Boomer generations, and we know the idiots of our generation personally. And so what we want to do is say, we don't want to brand ourselves as experts in terms of, I can give you some statistics, I can give you some things, but really what we felt like was that we were embedded. To say for us, we live and breathe millennial because that's what we are. I mean, that's where we live and exist. And so in writing the book, what we wanted to do was to acknowledge and say, yeah, there are definitely stereotypes. And for some reasons, there are good reasons for these stereotypes. But we want to tell you stories of people who are different than that, of people in our generation who are striving, who are working, but also to say, okay, so when you encounter a millennial just living in full-on entitlement, what do? How do you talk to someone like that? And so the book starts off, the first chapter's an introduction, and then we do the three big stereotypes, which we thought were laziness, entitlement, and then being a snowball. And just saying, oh yeah, or snowflake. I'm in Texas, just snow in general is snow. So we cover those three things and try and give not only perspective to say, yeah, we understand why people could see this. We understand why this became such a big deal in our culture, but then to respond and say, but please remember this isn't everyone. And just as much as people in other generations wouldn't want to say, well, I'm this because of what my generation is, what we're trying to do with the book is to say, hey, listen, millennials aren't simply millennial. They may have those tendencies, they may have those things, but they're more than that. And so those are the first three chapters, and then we do kind of a flip chapter where we talk about saying, hey, this is the enemy wants us to be an us versus them. The enemy doesn't want to see more people in the kingdom. So if the battle can be older generations versus millennials, he's going to push that as hard as he can to say, yeah, you guys argue with each other. Because if you're arguing with each other, the gospel isn't in that argument. Then we spend a couple chapters talking about the good things we see from our generation, good things that you can connect with, encourage, build up in. And then we end the book with a chapter on saying, hey, actually our sacramental theology as Lutherans gives us some pretty cool opportunities to connect with millennials. And that's not to say the Baptists don't have that, or the Presbyterians or the Methodists, but it's to say, hey, in our identity and who we are, we actually have some pretty cool concepts we can connect with. And then we end with kind of a bonus chapter of saying, okay, you sat through us talking for 10 chapters about relationships, and this isn't a program and there are no silver bullets, but here are some things you can do. And that's kind of like, hey, stop using Comic Sans and papyrus. Just kill it with fire. Make a good website. Go clean and simple over busy and complex. And just some of the things that we've learned, not only being millennials, but in church planting, the amount of hats I've had to wear. Graphic designer has become one of those, and so to be able to share and say, hey, here's some good places to look and go, and we argue to say it's not about. We're not trying to say you need to be attractional, but we're saying you want to be attractive. It's like cleaning the house when someone comes over, and so that's the way the book swings. And really, what we see in the midst of all of this is that there's a want and a need in the church to connect with millennials. Like, that is so amazing and exciting. And even as I handed the book to my parents to read it, and in their very boomer ways as they read it, there were things. My dad, who's a senior pastor of a church in Houston, he was calling me going, I hadn't even thought about this. And it was stuff that I assumed he'd know, but it's just stuff I knew because I was a millennial. And what we wanted to fight was saying, with this generation, you have to throw out the idea of a silver bullet, of saying, well, if we can do X, Y, and Z, millennials are going to come to our church. And instead, what we want to look and see and do is to say, what if I connected with two people of that generation? And what if a large number of people in your church, instead of saying, oh, what program are we going to build? What coffee shop can we have? How much avocado toast can we make on a Sunday morning? What if instead of those things, your people said, well, hey, I know this kid who just started at work. And maybe if I buy him a Snickers bar and a cup of coffee, so $3 a week, I can build a relationship with him. And our whole goal is to say, number one, in the church, we want to start conversations. We want to give a place where people can walk in and say, hey, we read this book, we read it together. Can we talk about this between generations? Can we talk and say, hey, I didn't understand this about your generation. I didn't understand this about mine, and to open up those possibilities. And then in terms of outside the church, to say, can you take time and space and be rooted enough in your identity in Christ to be in a long haul relationship with a millennial? And I look at that. So as a church plant, numbers for us are a survival thing. Like, that is both brilliant and it sucks at the same time. Like, it's this back and forth of, like, it's brilliant because it keeps us kind of on this gospel edge of saying, hey, we need to talk to people. We need to share the gospel. But it's stupid because it's like, oh, we may not be here next year because, we need more people. Luckily, we're past that point, I think. But, we'll see.
Yeah.
But there's that constant need that when we interact with people, we want them to come to church. And I think that's a very good thing. But through personal experience and what we're seeing statistics start to show is that where with other generations, there might have been a want to come and see and join an organization. With millennials, that relational quotient flips the organizational quotient. And so the investment in relationship might be, instead of weeks or months, be months or years. And for me, I think of, we have one of our leaders. She was a Young Life leader before moving up here. And so when she moved up to our area, Southwestern is the local college in town here, she started working with Young Life at the college. And she didn't have a whole lot of time, but they said, hey, could you lead this women's Bible study for us? She was like, yeah, no problem. So Fridays they get together. Now, the door has always been opened for those girls to come to our church, always been invited. And it's been a year and a half, and the first two have started coming. And that's what we're seeing more and more, is saying there are going to be people who are strong in their faith, who are looking, they're going to drop in and say, yeah, we're millennial and we're looking for a church and we want to be a part of your church. But there are a lot of not only non-Christian folks, but young Christians who it's going to take, hey, we had coffee for a year before you ever set foot in my church. hey, we hung out and this is stupid because just come to my church. Like, just be a part of this. And so what we want to do with the book is say, listen, it's about connecting. It's about relationship. And really, the funny thing to us was figuring out how to make sure we had the right word count, because we were like, listen, we could write this in a page. Step 1, do you know a millennial? If yes, go on to step 2. If no, meet a millennial. Step 2, invite them for coffee, beer, or food. If they say no, find another millennial. If they say yes, take them for coffee, beer, or food. Talk about things that they enjoy and you enjoy and hang out. Repeat until the Spirit leads an opening for you. And so that was kind of just the very basic thing of saying, okay, how do we convey this? And so we really broke it down into saying there's some key things that millennials are needing, that the church can be a part of, especially along the lines of mentoring or apprenticing, especially along the lines of saying a greater sense of community and being together in things. And all of those things come together and make for a moment that we saw in church history of saying, anyone can do this. You don't need permission. You don't need a program. What you need to do is know the story of Jesus in your life, because it's about going out, connecting with people, and sharing with them what Jesus is doing for you, and trusting that he's going to handle that. He's going to take care of it. And also knowing there's some punk millennials out there. I know several of them. They're my friends, and I've hit the point with them where I love how often as Christians we get caught up in this idea that it's like, oh yeah, it's my job to save people, when consistently we see the apostles and even in the teaching of Jesus, like, hey, if someone doesn't hear the message, just wipe your sandals off and go on to the next place. And so giving permission to say, listen, you're not going to connect with every millennial, but those people you do connect with, stay there, be present, stay connected. And I think the biggest thing for leaders in the church that we want to encourage is give opportunities for millennials to lead. Does anyone know off the top of their heads? I had to look it up, so if you do, that's amazing. What the life expectancy was in 1900?
Like 50.
42.
47. So right around that 40s, 50s area. What about last year?
70.
70.
Oh.
So someone gets the prize. So the life expectancy in the last 116 years has increased by plus or minus about 30-ish. And what that has meant for my generation is that the working age has risen. And so for us coming in to get entry-level jobs, the conveyor belt, if you will, hasn't kept moving. So people who were retiring aren't now. So what that means is then the people behind them aren't moving into their positions. And that stack up down the line means that a lot of millennials are coming out into places where there isn't not only in the job market, but in the church, there isn't a place for them. And I've seen this in a couple different ways, just in local churches, in terms of there's no mean-spirited, I think, agenda behind it. I think it's just, Frank has been on the board of elders for 20 years. He knows how to be an elder. Why would we ask Frank to leave and bring on this new kid who we have to train for a year before he's really got it under his belt? But what we're seeing is there's a loss of that ability to be in leadership, to be connected. And so I think for churches that have the ability to bring in their millennials and bring them into leadership positions, or even bring them into apprenticing positions, to say, hey, we want to tag you to be part of our, outreach committee, whatever it is, outreach team. We want you to train with Jan, who's been doing this for 25 years. And she's going to help bring you that position. And it's what the church has been doing for years. I think we've gotten a little lazy on it. I think we've gotten a little, we've just been living in that place of saying it's okay for us to be here. It's comfortable here. It's uncomfortable to train new leaders. But on the flip side of that, I heard this week from a friend. She recommended our book to someone randomly in the store, which that's been the most surreal thing. My wife just texted me that the book's on Target.com now, so, moving on up. But she was talking to this lady in the aisle of the grocery store. I don't know how the conversation started, but they are planting a church to reach millennials. And number one, bad idea. Like, if anyone comes to you and says, we should plant a church to reach millennials, as a millennial pastor planting a church, let me tell you, don't do it. Because what millennials need is that intergenerational mix. Because the biggest blessing on my life, not only as a pastor, but as a Christian, have been Paul and Becky Prince, who, read in the book, you'll hear about them. But Paul and Becky, she was a DCE for 20 years at our mother church. Paul has been in DCE ministry and then was one of our district's mission and ministry facilitators. And the fact that they decided to be a part of our church plant, which was really funny because they laid all the groundwork. They really helped push it and plan it. But Paul came to me when we first got here and he said, listen, Becky and I want to join you guys, but if you don't want that, that's okay. Like, we understand, we know that. I was like, stop. No, like, you're joining us because I have no idea what I'm doing and I need you along for the ride. And what's been a huge blessing with them is that they have treated us as their friends, that we've hung out with Paul and Becky, we've spent time with them, and to have that place, to have someone I can talk to say, wow, this is going poorly, and to have Paul go, well, let me tell you about this thing that happened in my early ministry. It's great. I have a friend, Mark, who's in Branson, Missouri, and he's a pastor there. And it was a couple days ago that I texted him, and I was like, please tell me that people of other generations are bad at budgeting, because I'm just smashing my head against the keyboard right now, because all I can think is I'm a millennial, and I don't know how to budget, and I'm the worst person ever. And he's like, no, don't put yourself on that island. And that's another big thing that factors in, is to say, like, it's so easy, even with the massive amounts of social media, of interconnectivity, millennials can easily get on their own because you see everything over the internet and your life isn't like that. And so to have a real flesh and blood person who says, yeah, real life isn't like that. Like, that's not how it is. Let me tell you about my days when I screwed it up and had to figure it out. And so for us, the crux of this book was to say, it's not just about connecting millennials, it's about connecting everyone together. It's about saying right now, millennials are the unknown generation that everything's getting blamed on. And so that'll change in 10 years. In 10 years, we're going to be talking about whatever this next generation is with their fidget spinners and their, about how, like, oh, look at how you kids have messed up all of the U.S. and culture. And it's funny because I remember in high school, everyone was like, oh, those millennials, they're so optimistic, they're going to come along and they're going to fix everything Gen X did. And now I'm reading the articles, oh, those millennials, they screwed everything up, and now, look who's coming along to fix everything they did. And it's just this hilarious thing how short our memories are to say, listen, generations have always been a thing. God talks about them. Almost from the beginning, he talks about them. But the way we view generations today is so much more based on marketing than it is actually what's going on. And so the crux of the book is to say, how can you connect with someone across those generational lines? How can you take it and walk it out? That we didn't just write the book for church workers, but we wrote it for the everyday Christian to say, how do you do this? It shouldn't just be the job of the people you pay at church. How do you walk this out? I think that's what I got for now. You guys are like the first people we've presented to, which Chelsea says hi. She's at work right now. So I apologize if that was terrible, but it was also like the first time we've done it. So thanks for being our guinea pigs.
Hey, for one, everybody has the book, so you can always say spoiler alert if you want to tell stories. And I may ask you, I'm going to ask you a few of the stories in the book. My first question is, you talk about generations, and your first chapter really kind of focuses on that, even your intro, and it kind of weaves through the rest of the book. So a couple of questions maybe stemming from that. First of all, how much do you think it is like place of life, age, or a circumstance of life versus actual generation? You kind of spoke a little bit as you were ending. You feel like the next group is going to be lazy too, or like it seems like some of that stuff is things we always talk about, the youngest generation, the young adult generation, and some of that is things that switch around. What do you think?
I think some of that is, I even sense it in myself that I catch myself looking at high schoolers going, "Oh, you lazy punks." Like I think there's always this idea: the further you get from where you are, the less you remember of being there. And I think that's just a human quality and trait that it's going to come. But I do think there are some aspects in our generation that that have pulled us towards some of those things. A big one was our generation was never on a total war footing, in terms of even, Iraq and Afghanistan never reached the point of where Vietnam was. And so I think I'd be interested to see someone who does, sociology, cultural studies to kind of look at that, or even to look at and say, well, we've been technically at war since we were in high school. And I think that functions in our culture to say, the greatest generation, well, the reason they were, a major reason they were the way they were was they had this major event in history where they all had to sacrifice, they all had to give. And I don't know if my generation has had, in this country, has had that moment which would pull some of that out of us. Another one I think is the extended adolescence, and we'll see if that transfers down to the next generation. But to say some of these things that are stereotypes for a reason, I think is because we've allowed a time period to exist where we didn't have to grow up, and I think that happens in every generation to some extent, but I think technology elongated that for us. I think the housing crash elongated that for us, and it brought out some of the worst qualities in where we are. But I do think part of it is a stage of life thing. I think, when you're in your high school and college years, you think you own the world and know what's going on, and as soon as you get out of that, you realize, oh, I have no clue about what's going on. And so I think there is a little bit of that stage of life. But the key thing, too, to remember with millennials is we're getting close to the end of millennials in college. And that's also a kind of weird differentiation because the years are, I've seen them all over the place, but I think the best spectrum is 1980 to 2000. Is what would be classified people born in those years. But like my sister, who was 84, and me, who's 86, and my brother, who was 1990, just between the three of us, you can almost see three very separate groups in millennials, because we hold some very similar views. But then on the flip side, my brother started wearing these really long socks, and I thought he looked like an idiot. Like there's this kind of breakdown, even in the millennial generation, and my college kids at the church plant are just on the cusp of it. And I remember the first time I had to Snapchat someone instead of texting them. And it was like the biggest old man moment I'd had in my life where like, why does this kid use texting? Like, they Snapchat me before they text me. And I'm like, this is stupid. Like, just text me. But I think, you know, the millennial generation, we have to start thinking less of late college, late high school, and start thinking more, these are young people and young families. And that was another reason we wanted to write about it, was to say, like, hey, we're old enough to tell you what's going on now.
So maybe when you talk about marketing, there's a couple of questions about that. So in the book, again, I think it's in the first, you kind of start right away, kind of setting the foundation of hey, we're trying to get rid of stereotypes, and here's some, and then here's some ways to kind of, you can help that a little further later in the book. But how do you, I'll give you this question, and then we can talk about the same way. How does marketing affect generations, or this generation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think you can see it in what I lean towards what makes people laugh, and what gets people talking. So like we have part of what we talk about on in the book, a big part of it is what we call Millennial Monday, which was named by my dad when he came to visit one time. But it's a group of friends. We just get together every Monday night for dinner, just hang out, you know, and we end up watching. There's a BuzzFeed series called Worth It, and it's these guys and what they do, and they pick a food and they say, okay, we're going to try, steak at 3 different prices and tell you which one was worth it. And so we watch that every week. And what I'm seeing in the differences there is these guys, you can watch it on YouTube, it's free, okay, but they're getting 20 million views a video, which means they're making millions of dollars off this 20-minute video of them being paid to go eat at these different places. And what I've started to realize is marketing is shifting to a more content-driven avenue as opposed to just straight, here's a commercial. And so what I'm seeing more and more is that the difference in how marketers are angling now, I think, has become much more content-driven, much more about an overarching story, or even about just the level of, I'd say sass that's coming now. If you watch, like, we have a moment in there in the book where we saw Wendy's Twitter was killing it last summer, and someone said, "Hey, Wendy's, roast me," and they said, "Well, we'll let one of your 56 followers do that." I mean, just straight burn them. And but that was something like we all laughed about. We all talked about it for 20 minutes. Now, are any of us going to eat at Wendy's? No, because we want organic, non-frozen food. So let's fall right into that thing. But I think in terms of marketing, it's becoming more relational, if you will. It's becoming more content-driven, more based in those things, as opposed to just, here's the best quality of why we've got these things, it's the best. But also, I've seen a lot of millennials swinging more towards longevity over price. They'll pay more for something if it's a good product with a good background, as opposed to going cheaper. And that's true and false in different ways. But if you really want to have fun, just look up any article that says, just type in "millennials are killing" and watch the list on Google. My favorite was "millennials are killing cereal," and the reason was because we don't like washing dishes. And to which we immediately had cereal night the following Monday at Millennial Monday to boost up our friends Kellogg's and General Mills. But yeah, I think that shift is happening.
Yeah, so maybe talk a little bit about that with ministry. You kind of alluded to it, that the fact that this particular to our generation has been marketed to so directly that they're pretty savvy at knowing when they're being marketed. And if I could disagree with me anytime, so it almost seems that that's why you need to have that slow burn you were talking about.
And I don't think it's wrong to market, but it's wrong to market and pretend you're not. I think for me that's the biggest thing is I haven't met anyone that's been upset at me when I invite them to our church. But if I were trying to be sneaky about it and be like, hey, there's this concert happening at this place, you should come, and they show up and it's a church, bad news. And I think learning how to tell, and this is something I'm struggling with right now in our church plant, is learning how marketing, advertising, I mean, everything we do can be more story oriented. Can be more focused on saying, hey, here's the overarching goal of all this. Here's how we talk. And one of the best things I came across, and the website made it into the book. It's called prochurchtools.com, and it's this dude up in Toronto. And but one of the things he talks about is he breaks down story very simply. He said a story is three things: a character with a desire, encounters a problem, makes a decision. And we've been trying, we're not great at it, but we're learning more and more how to frame everything we do, from Sunday morning announcements to blog posts on our website, to saying, how do we tell this as a story? Especially when you name your church Narrative Church, like we backed ourselves into a corner on storytelling. But I think learning Halloween's coming, and so I'd imagine, everyone's doing their form of trunk or treats, fall festival. The favorite one I heard lately was the, how do they phrase it? The Hallelujah Fall Festival, which I was like, well, that's one way to work, church into what you're doing. So say you're doing that. So instead of saying, hey, we're having trunk or treats this Saturday at 7 p.m., it's saying, hey, so I'll talk about me. When I was in high school, my mom started putting on trunk or treats at our church. And can I tell you, from every aspect, it was a good time. It was fun seeing how everyone decorated their cars, and it was really cool to see the kids and the community we got to engage with, even if they weren't coming to church, but just that our joy could be seeing these smiles. And so if you're interested in something like that, we're doing it this Saturday. You should come check it out, and especially if you want to decorate a car. And so it's bringing story into everything you're doing, which feels foolish, but helps people connect, because they hear, you're not just standing up here saying you want to do this. You're standing up here saying, hey, here's the reason why. Here's the background. Here's the excitement. And I think when it comes to millennials and church marketing and connection on a bigger scale, story's going to be better. And let me do a caveat real quick, and I'll lead with both, I apologize if this is something your church is doing, but at the same time, I'm not going to apologize, because I think it's something we should wait to do better. Live streaming, Facebook Live, video are all now at a point that doing them well is a budget bump, but not an insane place where it used to be. Where it used to be, you'd need $50,000 to $100,000 to do it professionally. You can do it professionally now for $20,000 and do it well for $10,000. And I would say, if we're putting out, our front face to people to say, yeah, we live stream, we make these videos, and what we're showing is kind of this lackluster, just hop on YouTube and search Casey Neistat. And you'll see what people are putting out with a handheld camera in their face on a daily basis. We're almost at cinematic quality. And I think we as a church have to step back and say, okay, there might be things we're not ready for. There might be things we say, listen, we're not ready to do video, but that doesn't mean we can't write a good blog post. or we might not be ready, to live stream, but that doesn't mean we're not going to put together a killer podcast or, those kinds of things. And that's all very outward-facing stuff. But I think we need to remember both the millennials as a generation and the generation behind us. The amount of media we've been exposed to is insane. And so the ability to open up a youth room and say, we have Xboxes. Great. Everyone has Xboxes now. To have some of those hard discussions to say, okay, if we can't attract, how do we then change it to a story that they connect with? I hope that makes sense.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So you also talk later in the book some key ways to make sure that you're connecting. And so relationships and community are really big. I love the story, I think it was even earlier in the book that you talked about Millennial Mondays. And then also community. I'm a Scooby-Doo fan, so I like that. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what you mean in the community section when you talk about Scooby-Doo? I'll just give it to you that way.
Yeah, and that's one of Chelsea's chapters, so I'll try and do it justice as best I can.
Sorry.
But it's the idea of if you watch, popular TV shows and media, you're going to see how different generations are going to react to different things. And so for us, you can especially look at sitcoms and look at the difference from Leave It to Beaver to Friends, from Friends to Modern Family, and to see really that there's a want for community in the millennial generation. The question is, can you have community that doesn't have, how do I put this right? Because I think every community needs intentionality, but community that isn't like a string leading somewhere. But the intentionality of your community is to say, we're going to be community. So like Monday nights, and this was my dad, when he first came, it was the Texas District, it was either a pastor's conference or something was happening in Austin. We live about 30 minutes north of where the conference was, so Dad came and stayed with us, and he leaned into me Monday afternoon and said, hey, do we need to beat traffic so we can get home to your group? Now, anyone else says group, and it's very innocuous. When my dad, who's a pastor, says group, his thought process was, we need to get home because your group, he's thinking small group Bible study, huddle, discipleship, whatever. And I had to look at him and go, you mean dinner? And that was the thing, was like his mind was racing so fast into, oh, what are you creating with this? And I was like, it's done. Like, we show up, we eat dinner. Sometimes we might play a game. Sometimes we watch YouTube. Sometimes we just sit around the table. The whole depth of that community is, here's what we're eating this week. Bring it. And that I think is what's missing sometimes in our churches, is community for the sake of building community, as opposed to, well, here's a community with this purpose or that purpose, or here's the missional purpose of this community. But what I've found is that as we've built community with this group of friends, most of them go to our church now, and those who don't are plugged into a church somewhere else. But what it's given us is a space to be open and honest about not only, the dumb things like, what was the worth it winner this week? What steak do you think you'd want to eat, from this YouTube video we watched? But these are the people I talk politics with, I talk theology with, I talk all of these things, and most of them are not, trained church folks. It's just people we can sit around and have these deep relationships with. And now, most of them are in our Thursday night Bible study community group. They're coming to churches on Sundays. And I think there's a need in our generation to be like, oh, we just need people to hang out with. And the whole purpose of that is to hang out. So I hope that hit the Scooby-Doo reference.
Yeah.
I know Chelsea does that, and so I'm trying to remember what it was.
The same kind of concept as the TV shows. Yeah. So, what do millennials need or want in worship, including an intergenerational worship community?
Authenticity. And that is the biggest buzzword, but should be tattooed on every pastor's forehead who's trying to reach millennials. And I say that as pastors, not because to put a hierarchy, but to say if the buck stops with those guys, authenticity has to be at the top down. Because I've seen a lot of people seek authentic community and authentic worship, but if it's not from the top down, millennials are going to walk in and recognize it.
Can you a little towards what that looks like? Like, what does authenticity in worship service look like?
I think it doesn't matter what style of worship you do. I actually think we've kind of beat that horse into the ground because I would argue that that's one of our us versus them conversations, as opposed to saying, hey, listen, if you do a liturgical style and that's what your church is, do it well. And people are going to walk in and see, hey, this is who you are. Like at Narrative right now, the way one of our worship leaders brilliantly phrased it was, we are, how did they say it? It was laid back, reverent. That before people come in, we're hanging out. It's just kind of laid back. But when we get going, we have a very reverent posture. We're very much, this is worship. This is where we are. And I'll tell you what, like, I'm the best guitar player we have at our church. And I don't say that as a prideful thing. I say that as skill level. That's where we are. Now, we have some really good guitar players at our church. But it's not like our band is the reason people are showing up at Narrative. But I think people walk in and they say, hey, this is who you guys are. We never try and be something more than we are. Well, that's not true. We strive to not be more than we are. We strive to not be less than we are. And I think the way you can take that and walk it into a very everyday sense is saying, are you doing things because you saw someone else do them? And you said, hey, we should do this because look at what it did for their church. Now, I think you can bring those discussions in, but if you're just doing it because another church is doing it, have good reasons behind it. Authenticity in worship, number one, always points back to Jesus. And number two says, this is who we are. We're not trying to be cooler. We're not trying to be, lamer. We're trying to live in the identity that Jesus has given our church. And I'll tell you what, as a church plant, like, we've got a couple really cool Lutheran church plants around us. And there are days that I go, man, if we only had, and then fill in the blank. If we only had the worship leader that Axel Leander has, if we only had, the lighting setup that, this church down the road had, and I have to stop myself and go, okay, am I being faithful to where God's called me, or am I trying, or is my jealousy coming in? And I think what millennials see is when they walk into a church, are the people welcoming? Are they connecting? And is the preaching honest to who they are? Is the teaching in Bible study or in and around honest to who those people are? And are people honest up front? There's not much I won't preach about that's happening in my own life, because I think it's very important for me, for people to see that I am not perfect. I am struggling with the things they're struggling with. And that authenticity says, but there is a Savior who is calling me to more, who is calling me to better. And if we keep living in this place where church leadership, from, DCEs to pastors to elders to Sunday school teachers, that they live in this place that they can't be honest about struggles and triumphs in Christ, I think millennials are going to walk in and read, these people are putting on a show for me to be here.
Yes, I still have a couple of we need. Anybody else have? How about this? One of the other things I love about the book is there's times you specifically speak to your generation. You have some side conversations, some uplifting and some hey, what the heck, guys? Just maybe speak words like why did you include that in the book?
Yeah. Part of it was, as we wrote, that was kind of part of the editorial process, was they said, hey, why don't we make these kind of stick out a little bit more? And then it was, hey, we need, this amount of these per chapter. But I don't feel like any of them were forced even after that point. I felt like most of them were good. I think part of the issue millennials have, because our penchant is to, for every response that another generation would have, millennials are lazy or they're entitled or all those things, we have the pushback. We have the thing that we can be like, yeah, well, we didn't mess up our economy. We didn't, start using fossil fuels to this level of, consumption. We didn't start these wars. We didn't, till the sun goes down. And what we wanted to do is to make sure that this just wasn't us writing a book that said, aren't millennials great? You all should get to know us. We wanted to call out millennials and be like, listen, you should read this book too, because people need to hear from you. And if people need to hear from you, we're going to drop the hammer on you, because we think it's time for you to start stepping up in leadership. We think it's time for you to start being committed to a church. We think it's time for you to start. And so for us, actually, sometimes it was easier to write those sections, because it's like those are our friends and the people we know really well, in our head. And so it's like, oh, those people we can call out pretty easily. Like we'll drop some fire on them because we know how to. But I think that the issue we run into with multi-generational stuff is when we start thinking that our generation has it right. And I can tell you, we are experiencing things in my generation we obviously don't have it right. And the pitfall is to say, everyone else is wrong and I am right. And so we wanted those in there to be like, millennials, like, make sure you're grounded as you read this. We want people to understand you. We want people to know you. But we also want to remind you just as much that you need to take a hard look at yourself. That it's not just about, and that's the big thing, is it's not just about people connecting with you. It's about you connecting with people. And I think that was the biggest part of it, was to say, millennials, we could talk about this all day and all night, but if you think people got to show up and cater to your every whim, and that really, for us, it hit off. There was a blog post by this kid who can't be more, because I straight up stalked him. He can't be more than like 25. And someone else had posted this blog, and I see this from time to time where people will post something, and they'll be like, yeah, we need to remember millennials and all this stuff. And what I get to is like, listen, I'm not some wounded animal. Like, I can do work. Like, I can push forward. And so I went and read this guy's blog post, and it was like the 12 ways, the church can get back with millennials. And all of them were, here's what you need to do for me. And some of them were very youthful things like, hey, we need to give more money to the poor, but also you need to hire more staff that know how to connect with millennials. And I was like, bro, have you ever done a church budget? Because those two things, I'm about, let's give more money to the poor, but you're not going to be able to hire more staff the more money you give away. I'm about it. Less staff, let's do it. But you can't have both those things. And so it was one of those things where it's like, you don't need other people solving your problems. You can step in and solve problems now. And that was my, we got heated around that, with saying millennials, stop acting like you're some victim. Step in. Say, yeah, I've been misunderstood, but you know what? I can be a part of helping that misunderstanding end. So.
And I think you do well with giving, you guys do well with giving steps to millennials, but you also, for all the church, you kind of give some practical, you have questions at the end, you also have some practical, do it, and I think that's even what you call it at the end, of us versus them, of hey, write a lament, but then see what Jesus maybe in your mind, and I know every church is different, and every person that we know that is in that age bracket is different, but maybe one or two or three things that maybe we should be going away from here, just trying or doing. Said a few of them, but give you like this will be the last like, hey, we're going home. What should we be doing?
Number one is praying. I think one of the things we talk about in the book is our generation is statistically the most clinically diagnosed generations with depression. And I think there's a lot there that the church can learn just from that one thing, to say something's wrong here. And instead of being angry about what millennials think or the amount of cereal they're killing, to start praying and saying, Lord, can you give us a heart for these people? That even if we're not converting them, that at least we're being the church to them. I started listening to a podcast recently by a guy I met in college, and it's basically they're dissecting Christian culture, and they bring in a guest star. And this is a guy who writes for Funny or Die and some of these things, so he's got a kind of a good pedigree behind him. And they bring in these guest stars, and the first thing they do is they tell their guestimony. And for me, it's been eye-opening to see how many people of my generation, which all these people are, the stories of what took them from church, the stories of what brought them away. And so step one would be pray. Like, pray for the hearts of my generation, but be praying that the Lord would open pathways to people in your life, that it's not just kind of this, pie in the sky prayer, but it's saying, Lord, put people in my way. Show me the people who need this. Step two will be a very practical one. Go look at good church websites. Like the Village Church in Dallas, Matt Chandler's church, is an incredible one. That's thevillagechurch.net. I'm trying to think of some other ones. Just look at that one. Look, you know what looks good, and then look at your church website. We are living in a time where building a church website has gotten simpler because the layout is simpler, and what we've done is that we want all our information on the front page. And what we tell people is, listen, your new church sign is your website. Like, I'll see your sign on the side of the road, but for people my age, 9 times out of 10, the first thing they do is Google you. And so if the first thing they see is this untidy website that looks like it's from 2001, what they're going to see is, oh, these people just don't care. And that's not true. There may have been a lot of discussion. There's, I understand that sometimes websites become this weird sacred cow. Like, it's this strange thing that's like, well, but I designed this website. Great, you did it in 1998. We're really proud of you. Squarespace exists now. Like, you can do this. But I would encourage you, spend time looking at what is considered good and saying, okay, we don't maybe have to be that, but how can we be better? Because that's your welcome mat. And so I think personal relationship trumps what your website looks like, obviously, and people are not going to come simply based on your website, but there will be people who will look and say, oh, this is foolish.
They definitely won't stay because of the website. They may come because of the website, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the third thing I'd say is, well, I do two more things. So I'll break the rules like a good millennial. The first one is figure out what you like doing. Like, you guys were talking about Sabbath, and right now my Sabbath is very small because the Astros are in the playoffs and not doing very well right now. And so that's been strange. But baseball is a great way for me to connect with people. Hanging out with my dog is a great way to connect with people. Figure out those things you're passionate about. And I remembered my dad, and it was because he read the book. He called me, and Steven, who's a year or two younger than me, is the worship leader at my dad's church. And he calls me and goes, "Hey, I've got tickets to the Astros game tonight." This was a couple months ago. And he goes, "Do you think I should ask Steven? Like, would that be a good thing?" And I know Steven's a huge baseball fan. I was like, "Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's like, you like something, they like something, do it together." So make a list of two things: what you like doing, what you like talking about, but also what you have experience and wisdom on. I can't tell you how many young parents have told me, "I just wish people the next level ahead of me would sit down and tell me how they did it." I think we're missing an opportunity because I think it's less about parenting classes now and more about saying, are you willing to sit down and have coffee with a younger mom or dad and say, "Hey, here's how it is." Like, and I heard the picking up Cheerios. Like, "Hey, that sucks. Let me tell you about, like, some of the things that we did. Let me share with you when I failed, so you know that, like, you're not a failure." Those kinds of things. I think those. So two things. What do I enjoy talking about? What wisdom do I have to share? And then finally, write your story. Look out and say, what is my testimony? As Lutherans, we fear that word, and it is to our detriment. But look and say, Revelation tells us they overcame him, being the devil, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And I think we shouldn't fear that, because if we're going to tell stories, we need to be able to tell the greatest story in our life, which is to say, this is what Jesus did for me, and here's what he continues to do today. So those four things.
Well, I thank you for taking your time. That was good stuff. And,
Yeah.
Anything else?
No, Ted, appreciate it. Thank you very much for the time, and glad we get to bring you in on kind of the cyberspace book tour. If we want to go. I will throw this out to the group here, because as you mentioned about looking at your website, Aaron Lucas, who was in here helping set things up, is available to do consulting from the district to your church. So that if you're looking at it and going, this needs help, we have one of our own millennials on staff that can be deployed to you, so he can deliver the message, and has some credentialing that may be able to help move that conversation along if you're not succeeding in doing so. But anyway, that's my little extra commercial. But Ted, thank you, appreciate the time.
Yeah.
And
Take your wife too.
yes.
Yeah, I'll tell her she was sorry she couldn't be here. She works at a local elementary school, so it's, hard to get away.
Good call. Thank you.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Yep.
Yeah, over.